So how do you know whether you should be choosing aperture priority when you're taking a photograph or shutter speed priority? What is the difference? So that's the purpose of this podcast. Before I get into it, I would just like to ask you to like and subscribe and comment if you'd like to. Feedback is always good. And in fact, that's what's prompted this particular podcast, because I ran a workshop at the weekend and this question came up, and I thought it was a good one to share because it's one of those issues that I know can be a bit confusing when you start looking at modes on the camera. Should you be making shutter speed your priority, or should it be aperture? And with aperture, depth of field. So shutter speed is about movement, aperture is about what's in focus. So first of all, what I want to do is back up the truck a little bit, and I want you to think about your subject. So you need to ask yourself some questions, and the first one is the subject going to be moving or stationary? So if it's not moving, then presumably you've got time to set up the shot, and I would suggest that depth of field is probably the most important consideration. So this is probably pretty straightforward, because if your subject isn't moving, you then need to look at, are there items in the foreground, items in the background that can be confusing, i.e. might draw the viewer's eye away from the subject. So if there are, you really want to put those out of focus to some extent at least, so that even if the person looking at the photograph looks at them, their eye is always drawn back to your subject. So where I always get back to is make sure you have a strong, clear subject. So ask the question, what is this photograph all about? And when you answer that question, you'll have a subject, and then everything else you do really needs to be supporting that subject. So that's the first question. Now, if your subject is moving, then you need to look at some other things. So how fast is it moving? What kind of shutter speed do you need? Do you want movement in the image, or do you want it frozen? Now, this is where it gets a little bit more murky, I would say, because it comes down to how you like to work. So speaking for myself, and I've photographed a lot of animals that were moving. So things like humpback whales breaching, they're moving pretty fast when you consider that a breach is over in a couple of seconds. And also you've got that added bit of difficulty because you don't always know where the whale is coming up. I would say probably most of the time, you might have a rough idea based on how it's been swimming, but you don't know. So you probably have to move onto the animal while you're photographing it. So clearly in that situation, having a high shutter speed, so I would say in the region of 1,000th of a second, is the kind of ballpark you want to be if you want to freeze all of the action, freeze water droplets in the air, all that kind of thing. So that might suggest that shutter speed would be the way to go. However, in my own experience, what I prefer to do is still run with aperture priority, because I also want to set the depth of field. Now, if there's nothing in the foreground and nothing in the background, arguably it doesn't really matter. Because if you've got a whale, sea in front, sky behind, there's not really too much is going to conflict with your subject. So in that situation, it doesn't really matter. You just really want to freeze the action. However, you might have things in the background like cliffs, or, it might be a suburb or something if you're close to the coast. And then I prefer to have that out of focus. Now, or at least out of focus to some extent, slightly blurred. It doesn't have to be, we're not talking bokeh here, but just so that it is definitely a supporting part of the image. It's providing context to the subject, but it is not conflicting visually with the subject. So for me, I still run with aperture priority, but what I'll do in that instance is just vary my sensitivity, the ISO, so that I can get the kind of shutter speed that I want. And I'll just check it out. I'll point the camera in the general direction I think the whale's going to be. Quick test shot to make sure I've got the right sort of shutter speed, so around 1,000th of a second, let's say. and run with that. Because also you have to remember that when you're in a situation where there's perhaps, well, it's going to be directional light anyway, but depending on where you're pointing your camera, you'll probably find that the shutter speed, if you're on aperture priority, the shutter speed will vary depending on whether you're pointing into the light or away from the light. There'll be likely to be a bit of a change, and that will also depend on what time of day you're photographing. So there are a number of variables, and you may decide that that's sort of getting in the too hard basket, and you just want to flip across to shutter speed priority. Set yourself to 1,000, let the camera work out the aperture and therefore depth of field. And that's perfectly fine. So this is where it comes down to preference, experience, and really what works for you. So where you have a moving animal, that definitely can be a less clear-cut situation. Now, another situation, and it's possibly the only one where I would tend to flip across to shutter speed priority, is where I'm photographing something. It might be a car. So I've done a little bit of motor racing photography, not much, but a little bit. And I used to go to air shows quite a lot and photograph aircraft in flight. And I used to find that with propeller-driven aircraft, and I see this a lot, what a lot of people do is just bump their shutter speed up really fast. So again, up to about 1,000th of a second, somewhere in that order. And what that will do is freeze the propeller blade. You might get a tiny bit of blurring on the blades of the propeller, but on the whole, it looks very static. And to me, that's a really uninteresting shot because that aircraft could be a model. It doesn't look that real. It could be a model just up in the air, however you've done that. And there's no feeling, there's no interest. And again, it's obviously personal preference. So I'll slow things down and I'll start getting into hundredths of a second, maybe the low hundredths of a second, because what then happens, and obviously it depends on how quickly, in this case, a propeller blade is turning. But what you're going to get is some degree of arc on the propeller. It might be the full propeller arc, so a blurred disc at the front of the aircraft, or you might have, say, blurred quarters of arc. As the disc rotates while you have the shutter open. Again, it's personal preference. My opinion doesn't really matter. The point is you've captured that movement so that now you can see in that image, there's movement in that image. And to me, that brings it alive. That separates it from these sort of static shots that, to me, are pretty uninspiring. So that's why I'll shoot those at those lower shutter speeds. Now, again, how does your subject stand out? So coming back to depth of field, if you have your subject, which is an aircraft in this case, what's in the background and what's in the foreground, and will any of those things in the foreground or background detract from the subject? So, and what I mean by that is, will they actually catch the viewer's eye more than your subject will? And if it does, then those elements in the image aren't supporting the subject. They're kind of fighting with it, might be winning. So the thing to do there is just look at what's in the frame. If you do have things in foreground and background that are likely to kind of dominate the image, then I would try and put those out of focus a little bit, because then it will always draw the viewer's eye back to the subject. Often with things like aircraft, because they're quite high, you generally don't have much in the way, if anything. So you can get away with not worrying too much about depth of field because you've got your subject and nothing really in front of and behind it that will detract from the image. However, when you get onto things like motor racing, obviously the cars are on the ground, well, possibly on the ground, or if they're not on the ground, they're not that high, far off the ground. So you do have a situation where it's quite likely that you'll have foreground items and background items that are likely to conflict with the subject. So here again, the trick is to shoot slower. And what I mean by that is shooting hundredths of a second, maybe 1/250th of a second or 1/125th, something like that. And when you're photographing at a relatively slow shutter speed, the important thing is to just pan with the subject. So you're moving with the subject and you're trying to keep that subject in exactly the same part of the frame while the shutter is open. And if you get that right, and it does take practice, and when I was learning this, I was doing this with a film camera, so I couldn't even check it straight away. It might be days before I could even look at the prints or the slide film, whatever I was using, to see if I'd got it right. But persevere and you get there. These days with digital, it's much, much easier because you can have a look straight away and see how you're doing, and then, change your approach. But you plan with the subject at a slower shutter speed. And what that will do, if you get it right, is your subject will be really sharp. So if it's, let's say, a Formula One car, for example, the car itself will be pin sharp. The driver, so you can see the driver's helmet, that will be pin sharp. But anything else in the background or the foreground will be blurred because you'll have that motion blur on it because you're moving, because you're panning. And also, if you get it right, things like the wheels themselves, the tires, usually there's some sort of graphic or writing on the tire, that will all be blurred. So you've got all of that movement in the image. And that to me is a good image, a successful image. And if you want to practice that, just, find a road where there are cars going by and just photograph them, if that's okay where you live. So in that instance, though, what are the key criteria? So I'm going to go to shutter speed priority because depth of field doesn't matter. As long as I'm focused, and obviously that's a separate issue, you need to have a good focus on whatever you're taking a photograph of. So if you're using autofocus, you need to have that set up correctly with the right kind of AF point grouping and all that kind of thing. And also the AF mode, whether it's single shot or continuous, all that sort of thing. So that's another aspect. But when it comes to the exposure triangle part of it, you can use shutter speed priority because depth of field in that situation sort of becomes irrelevant as long as the subject itself is in focus. Because even if the things in the foreground and background would be in focus if it was a static shot, the fact that they're moving, so you'll have motion blur, and the fact that your subject is sharp in the frame, that kind of does the same thing as depth of field does, in as much as you're providing context, you're providing environment, you are supporting the subject with something that is relevant. And in this case, and if you think about it with a racing car, having speed, giving a suggestion of speed does support really the purpose of a racing car, which is to generally go fast. So there are two situations, and as I've said, normally I would use aperture priority, but in the case of shooting something that's moving fast, where I'm going to get motion blur in deliberately, then I might switch to shutter speed priority, because the shutter speed, I want it to be a certain speed because I know that's going to give me the blur. I know I can pivot, and I've got a good chance of getting that subject nice and sharp. So that would sort of point me back to shutter speed priority. Now, the other thing that came up, and this is with someone who's been actually a great support of what I'm doing, so I do appreciate that feedback, was shooting. The example he gave was actually shooting a nativity scene in a church, but basically a situation where you're in a low light environment and you have a subject. In this case, you've got a nativity scene with a stained glass window behind it. So here, again, I would tend to go for aperture priority, and I'm going to be using a support. So it might be a tripod, or you might be in a situation where it's low light, but you don't have a tripod. So you need to really brace the camera against something. That's what I generally do. I'll just find somewhere that I can push the camera hard against something so that it doesn't move. And then I'll just hold it there, press the shutter button down gently, hold the button down, and then wait until I hear the mirror flip closed again, so you can hear that and feel it actually often. If you're using mirrorless, it'll depend on how you've set the camera, but you want that audio feedback that the camera has taken the shot and then it's safe to move everything. So in that situation, I'm going to go with aperture priority because it's depth of field again, it's really important. And what I can also do, because I'm using a tripod or I'm bracing, it means that the shutter speed can be very slow. So we're now looking at probably tenths of a second. So it could be a 60th, something like that, or even slower. But what I will do, I'll get that shutter speed slow because I want to get the ISO down as low as possible. So remember, when you're using ISO, ISO is your sensitivity of your sensor, or the film if you're using film. But obviously in this case, we're really talking digital photography. So as you push the ISO up, the camera will get more sensitive to light. So you make the sensor more sensitive to light, but you also start introducing noise. Now, how much noise you introduce will depend on the camera you're using, because some cameras are really good at high ISOs. They've got very little noise in them. But for the most part, the chances are you're definitely going to see an increase in noise in your image as you push the ISO up. And the reason you would push the ISO up is to allow you to have a fast shutter speed. So if you make the ISO more sensitive, then you can get away with a faster shutter speed, which means if you're hand holding, you can keep it above the reciprocal of the focal length, which is the general rule of thumb for what's the slowest shutter speed you can use when you're hand holding the camera. So if you're on a tripod, though, all of that goes out the window, because now you can wind the ISO down low. Because the other reason you don't want a high ISO is it tends to pick up internal electrical noise, and it will show up as it's essentially noise in a digital camera is pixeling. So the pixels become a lot more obvious. And in the worst case, you'll actually get areas of light and dark. It starts to look really horrible. So you want the ISO as low as possible. And if you're on a tripod, you can just wind it right down, and you can just set a very, very slow shutter speed, even less than a tenth of a second, something as slow as that. If you're on a tripod, you're fine. You're not going to have any movement. And if you brace it correctly, you won't have any movement. What I do recommend you do if you're using a DSLR is to just block off the viewfinder. So on some cameras, you might have an internal kind of slide thing that will block off the viewfinder. In most cameras, what you're likely to find is a little rubber cap thing, and often it's on the camera strap. And I know some people don't know what that's for. So if there's a little rectangular cap thing on your camera strap, you'll find that it's got slots inside it, and this will slide over the top of the viewfinder. So if you look at your viewfinder, it might be where the rubber eye cap is. You might have to slide that off, but this little cover will slide onto that, onto the viewfinder. And what it does, it just blocks out the light coming in from the viewfinder. So with the shutter up, you don't get stray light coming in onto the sensor from the viewfinder. So that is what that thing is there for. So if you are doing particularly a longer shot in an environment, perhaps a lower light environment, is just try it with and without that cover. You may not need it. I often don't use it unless I'm particularly doing something where I really want to make sure there's no stray light coming in. But for more casual stuff, say something like a church, if you're just standing behind the viewfinder, perhaps close enough to shade it from most of the light that's around, most of the ambient light, then that may well be good enough. But these are just things you can do to make sure you get the best possible result. So that is pretty much it. So a little bit shorter than normal perhaps, but hopefully this is useful. So I guess just to recap, when you're trying to decide whether you should be using aperture priority or shutter speed priority in your modes. So number one, what's your subject? And which aspect of a mode is going to best support the subject? So is it depth of field or is it shutter speed? And by support the subject, I mean make sure that subject is clear and that the background, so the rest of the photograph, is supporting the subject in some form. So it might be providing context, it might be making the subject stand out in some way, but it needs to be supporting the subject so that that aspect of composition is there. Secondly, My own personal preference is for most of what I do, I'll be using aperture priority, even where shutter speed becomes important. So in the instance of a humpback whale. So I know that the camera is going to set the shutter speed, but I just need to make sure that whatever the camera does, it's setting the shutter speed in the sort of range that I know will work for the shot I'm doing. Now, there have been occasions where I'll just flip it and go to shutter speed priority. If there's a lot of variance in the shutter speed that the camera is going to set automatically, and it might be where the light levels are changing. So it could be a bright day, but with a bit of cloud coming and going. So that can have an impact on the actual shutter speed that the camera selects, and obviously whether I'm looking towards the light or away from the light. So you need to make a judgment call on it. So this comes back down to just understanding the two modes. So I would definitely recommend using both and just going out and shooting with both, getting the result you want with both modes, so that you're familiar with them, even if you've got a preference. So as I say, in my case, most of what I do is aperture priority, but with that experience, you can switch to shutter speed priority if you feel that the sort of shutter speed that the camera is going to set up is not going to work for you. So this is where understanding the modes and being familiar with both of them is really important. So look at your subject, and if it's static, so here I'm thinking wildlife, because I like to shoot wildlife. It's a wildlife podcast primarily. So there you go. That's relevant. So if it's an animal that's in, the undergrowth somewhere, so it might be sat in front of a bush and there might be long grass. So basically you've got foreground and background components of the image that can detract from the subject. So you always want the subject to stand out. So for a portrait sort of shot of an animal, I always use a very narrow depth of field. I might be at f5.6, something like that. It depends on other factors, what actual setting you use. I'm not going to go into those, but in my course I do. So jump on and buy the Introduction to DSLR and Mirrorless Photography course. But if you've got a static subject, you can then sort of play with that, and using aperture is very easy. If you've got a moving subject, that becomes a little bit trickier, but generally it's not crucial. I would say the most difficult things to shoot are things like humpback whales, simply because often you don't know exactly where they're coming up and how far away they are. So you need to set a kind of in focus box that you know that anything popping up in that area will be in focus. But also you've got to shoot quite fast, and you might be moving to get onto the animal as it's moving, and a breach, as I say, is over in a couple of seconds. So you've really got to be ready for it and know what you're doing. So lots of practice, basically. And if you are going to shoot something that's moving, and if it's moving across your field of view, so left to right or right to left or up or down, I suppose, down or up, the key thing there is that anything that is likely to be a distraction, foreground and background, if you are using a slow enough shutter speed and moving fast enough, so you've got that motion blur, then I would argue that depth of field is much less important, because what you really want to do is make sure that your subject is nice and sharp, and then everything else that would otherwise be in focus, you've got that motion blur, so it no longer detracts from the subject. Because and practice with it if you don't believe me, but when you've got everything else moving and your subject's nice and sharp and still, that definitely stands out. And then finally, if you have a tripod, I, as I say, prefer aperture priority, and I will just wind down the ISO and the shutter speed as low as I can, because I want to get a really good resolution on the image, because I might want to blow it up. So I want to absolutely minimize the chances of getting noise in the image, digital noise in the image. So ISO goes right down, but because I'm on a tripod, I can just pop the shutter speed down nice and low as well to compensate for that. Obviously, that assumes that the subject isn't moving, even if it's not moving very quickly, because then you're going to, again, start introducing motion blur if your shutter speed is too low. So I guess to conclude all of this, the chances are you'll have a preference based on how you like to approach your photography. And that is fine. And it's all part of having your own style. So whether it's aperture priority or shutter speed priority as a mode, either one is fine. But I do recommend that you understand both of them and you get familiar with both of them so that in a given situation, you can switch from one to the other if the one that you would normally use is not going to give you the result that you want. And again, that result, I would argue, is always to have a clear, sharp subject, or normally a sharp subject, not necessarily, but normally a clear subject, and to have a background in the image that supports the subject. So when you get right down to it, that's about as difficult as it gets. And then you just work off everything else from there. So I hope you found that useful. Please take a look at the website. I've now got some ebooks that help with photography as well as courses. And there are free challenges, 14-day challenge, all that kind of stuff. So please take a look and I'll speak to you in the next podcast. Bye for now. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Now, I just want to say thank you for tuning in and joining me in the Wildlife and Adventure Photography podcast. If you have enjoyed today's episode, please give me a like, a subscribe, maybe tell your friends, and by all means leave a comment. And if there is a subject you would like me to cover in the future, please let me know and I'll be very happy to do my best. So thanks again for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again next podcast. Bye for now.